What you think is harmless sexual fantasy is actually a form of psychological possession, where autonomous complexes hijack your consciousness, drain your life energy, and prevent authentic development. Carl Jung's clinical analysis reveals that sexual fantasies operate as parasitic psychological entities that control your behavior while creating the illusion that you're choosing to engage with them voluntarily. Fantasy possession. Jung's clinical work revealed that sexual fantasies operate as what he called autonomous complexes, semi-independent psychological entities that possess their own energy, agenda, and capacity to influence consciousness and behavior without the person's conscious consent or control. These complexes function like psychological parasites that feed on attention and life energy while growing stronger and more demanding over time. The possession process begins subtly with seemingly innocent sexual thoughts or images that capture your attention more intensely than normal mental content. Unlike ordinary thoughts that you can easily dismiss or redirect, fantasy complexes have magnetic quality that pulls your consciousness into their orbit and resists attempts at conscious control or redirection. Jung observed that people under fantasy possession often describe feeling taken over by sexual thoughts and images that seem to arise spontaneously and demand immediate attention regardless of appropriate context or timing. These intrusive fantasies interrupt work, social interactions, and daily activities because the complex has developed enough autonomous power to override conscious intentions and priorities. The possession mechanism operates through what Jung called identification, where your sense of self becomes confused with the fantasy complex, making it feel like the sexual thoughts and desires represent your authentic self, rather than recognizing them as foreign psychological material that has infiltrated your consciousness. This identification makes resistance feel like self-denial rather than psychological self-defense. Fantasy complexes also demonstrate their autonomous nature through their capacity to evolve and intensify without conscious direction. People often report that their fantasies become progressively more extreme, specific, or compulsive over time, following their own internal logic and developmental pattern rather than responding to conscious preferences or moral values. The possession dynamic becomes particularly evident during attempts to eliminate or reduce fantasy engagement. The complex resists these efforts through increased intensity, emotional manipulation, rationalization, and psychological pressure that can feel overwhelming and irresistible. This resistance reveals that the fantasy operates according to its own agenda rather than serving conscious goals. Jung understood that fantasy possession typically begins during periods of psychological vulnerability, times of stress, loneliness, boredom, or emotional pain, when normal psychological defenses are weakened and consciousness becomes susceptible to autonomous complex infiltration. The fantasy initially appears to provide relief or pleasure, but gradually establishes parasitic relationship with consciousness. The possession process also involves what Jung called inflation, where engagement with sexual fantasy creates temporary feelings of power, excitement, or transcendence that contrast sharply with ordinary consciousness. This inflated state becomes psychologically addictive because it provides escape from the limitations and responsibilities of actual life. Circumstances. Most people fail to recognize fantasy possession because the complex operates by mimicking authentic desire and personal preference, making its influence feel like natural expression of sexuality rather than external manipulation of consciousness. This camouflage allows the complex to grow stronger while avoiding detection and conscious resistance. The ultimate goal of fantasy possession appears to be the complete capture of psychological energy and attention, creating what Jung observed as fantasy addiction, where increasing amounts of time, energy, and consciousness get consumed by sexual fantasy, while capacity for real achievement, relationship, and personal development steadily diminishes. Shadow Compensation. Jung's analysis reveals that sexual fantasies often serve as compensation mechanisms for repressed or undeveloped aspects of personality that have been excluded from conscious identity. Due to social conditioning, moral training, or traumatic experiences that made certain psychological qualities feel dangerous or unacceptable, the shadow compensation function means that fantasy content typically represents psychological material that you've disowned or rejected about yourself, but that continues seeking expression through unconscious channels. The dominant or submissive themes in sexual fantasy might compensate for overdeveloped compliance or control in conscious personality, while taboo or forbidden fantasy content might represent natural human impulses that were suppressed during moral development. Jung observed that the intensity and compulsiveness of sexual fantasies often correlates directly with the degree of repression applied to corresponding psychological qualities. People who maintain rigid conscious control over aggressive, selfish, or pleasure-seeking impulses often develop intense sexual fantasies that allow unconscious expression of these forbidden qualities in seemingly safe psychological space. Compensation mechanism explains why sexual fantasies frequently involve scenarios that contradict conscious values and preferences. The fantasy serves to balance psychological economy by providing outlet for repressed material that would otherwise create internal pressure and potential psychological symptoms like depression, anxiety, or compulsive behaviors in other areas. Shadow compensation through sexual fantasy creates what Jung called split personality, where conscious identity becomes increasingly disconnected from authentic psychological totality. The person maintains socially acceptable facade while secretly engaging with fantasy material that represents their disowned psychological qualities, creating internal fragmentation and loss of psychological integrity. The compensatory function also explains why attempts to eliminate sexual fantasies through willpower or moral effort typically fail and often intensify the fantasy compulsion. Suppressing fantasies without integrating the shadow material, they represent simply increases internal pressure and strengthens the autonomous complex that generates fantasy content. Jung's therapeutic approach involved helping patients understand what psychological qualities their sexual fantasies represented, so these qualities could be consciously integrated in appropriate ways rather than remaining trapped in unconscious fantasy compensation. This integration typically reduced fantasy compulsion because the psychological need for compensation was resolved through conscious development. The shadow compensation analysis also reveals why fantasy content often evolves toward more extreme or taboo material over time. As initial fantasy themes become familiar and lose their compensatory power, the complex must generate more intense content to provide adequate expression for continuing repressed psychological material. Understanding fantasy as shadow compensation allows for therapeutic rather than moralistic approach to fantasy problems. Instead of judging fantasy content as good or bad, Jung encouraged analyzing what legitimate psychological needs the fantasy represents and finding conscious ways to meet these needs through real-world development and expression. The compensation mechanism demonstrates that sexual fantasy typically represents misguided attempt at psychological healing and integration rather than simple moral failure or lack of self-control. This understanding opens possibilities for resolving fantasy compulsion through conscious development, rather than continued repression that strengthens the shadow complex. Projection mechanics. Jung's analysis of sexual fantasy reveals sophisticated projection mechanisms where unconscious psychological material gets attributed to imagined others, creating illusion of external relationship while actually representing internal psychological dynamics that prevent authentic intimacy and real human connection. The projection process involves unconsciously assigning psychological qualities, emotional needs, or archetypal energies to fantasy figures who then seem to possess these qualities. independently rather than recognizing them as aspects of your own psyche, seeking integration and expression. The passionate, nurturing, or powerful qualities you perceive in fantasy figures typically represent your own undeveloped potential rather than actual characteristics of imagined others. Fantasy projection creates what Jung called false relationship, where emotional and sexual energy gets invested in psychological constructs rather than real people, preventing the development of authentic intimacy skills and genuine human connection. The fantasy relationship feels safer and more controllable than real relationship, but provides no actual growth or satisfaction because it involves relating to projected aspects of yourself rather than encountering another consciousness. The projection mechanism explains why sexual fantasies often feature idealized figures who possess perfect combinations of desired qualities without the complexity, unpredictability, and imperfection that characterize real human beings. These fantasy figures represent projected archetypal images rather than actual people, which is why they can be perfectly responsive to your needs and desires in ways that real relationships never are. Jung observed that people heavily invested in sexual fantasy often struggle with real relationships because they unconsciously expect actual partners to fulfill the projected qualities that fantasy figures seem to possess. This creates unrealistic expectations and disappointment when real people fail to match the perfection of projected fantasy images. The projection process also prevents psychological development because the qualities projected onto fantasy figures remain undeveloped within your own personality. Instead of developing your own passion, creativity, strength, or nurturing capacity, you experience these qualities only through fantasy relationship with projected images that possess them on your behalf. Fantasy projection often involves what Jung called animus projection, where contrasexual aspects of personality get attributed to fantasy figures of the opposite gender. Men might project their undeveloped emotional, intuitive, or creative qualities onto idealized women in fantasy, while women might project their undeveloped assertive, intellectual, or independent qualities onto idealized men. The projection withdrawal process involves recognizing that qualities you find compelling in fantasy figures actually represent aspects of your own psychological potential that need conscious development rather than fantasy consumption. This recognition allows you to reclaim projected energy and direct it toward actual self-development and real relationship building. Jung's therapeutic approach involved helping patients identify what specific qualities they were projecting onto fantasy figures, and exploring how these qualities could be developed within their own personality and expressed through real-world relationships and creative activities, rather than remaining trapped in fantasy projection. The projection analysis also reveals why fantasy addiction often correlates with social isolation and relationship difficulties. The energy invested in fantasy projection becomes unavailable for real relationship development, while unrealistic expectations based on projected perfection make actual human connection feel disappointing and inadequate by comparison. Energy vampirism. Jung's understanding of psychological energy reveals that sexual fantasies operate as energy-draining mechanisms that hijack libido, the fundamental life force that should fuel creative achievement, personal development, and authentic relationship, and redirect it towards sterile psychological consumption that produces no real-world value or satisfaction. The vampiric process begins when fantasy engagement triggers neurochemical responses designed for actual sexual encounter and relationship building. But these powerful energetic activations get discharged through imaginary interactions rather than serving their biological and psychological functions of bonding, reproduction, and pair bond formation with real partners. Jung observed that patients heavily involved in sexual fantasy typically exhibited what he called chronic energy depletion, persistent fatigue, lack of motivation for real-world goals, reduced creativity, and diminished capacity for sustained effort toward meaningful achievements. The fantasy consumption was literally draining the psychological energy needed for authentic living and personal development. The energy drain operates through what Jung identified as libido misdirection, where sexual energy that should motivate real relationship building, creative expression, and life achievement gets channeled into fantasy consumption that provides temporary psychological satisfaction while contributing nothing to actual life development or authentic fulfillment. Fantasy energy vampirism creates what Jung called psychological inflation during fantasy engagement, followed by deflation afterward, leaving the person with less energy than before the fantasy episode. This cycle resembles substance addiction, where the temporary high is followed by crash that leaves the person worse off than before consumption. The vampiric mechanism explains why sexual fantasy often interferes with real productivity and achievement. People report difficulty concentrating on work, pursuing goals, or engaging with real relationships after fantasy episodes because the energy that should fuel these activities has been drained through fantasy consumption. Jung also noted that fantasy energy drain creates compensatory seeking, where people unconsciously pursue more fantasy consumption to restore the energy that previous fantasy episodes depleted, creating escalating cycles of energy vampirism that become increasingly difficult to escape through willpower alone. The energy analysis reveals why people often feel shame and regret after fantasy engagement, even when no moral or ethical boundaries were violated. The shame represents unconscious recognition that vital life energy was wasted on sterile psychological consumption rather than invested in activities that build real capability and authentic satisfaction. Fantasy vampirism also affects what Jung called social energy, the psychological capacity for genuine human interaction and relationship building. People heavily involved in fantasy often report feeling socially exhausted or awkward because their relational energy has been discharged through fantasy interaction rather than being available for real social connection. The energy recovery process involves recognizing fantasy consumption as energy theft and redirecting sexual energy toward activities that build real capability, authentic relationship, and creative expression rather than providing temporary psychological escape that ultimately weakens overall life energy and achievement capacity. Jung's therapeutic approach involved helping patients understand how fantasy consumption was affecting their energy levels and life achievement, then developing strategies for redirecting sexual energy toward goals and relationships that would provide genuine satisfaction and build real capability, rather than creating temporary pleasure followed by energy depletion. Unconscious programming. Jung's analysis reveals that sexual fantasy content emerges from deep unconscious programming created by cultural conditioning, early life experiences, media exposure, and traumatic events that shape sexual imagination in ways that often contradict conscious values and authentic desires, while serving unconscious psychological needs and unresolved conflicts. The programming process begins early in development when sexual curiosity encounters cultural messages, family attitudes, religious teachings, and social conditioning that create unconscious associations between sexuality and power, shame, forbiddance, pleasure, emotional healing, or other psychological themes that become embedded in fantasy patterns throughout life. Jung observed that fantasy content often reflects what he called cultural shadow, the collectively repressed sexual attitudes and behaviors that get expressed unconsciously through individual fantasy, rather than being consciously integrated into healthy sexual development and authentic relationship expression. Traumatic programming occurs when sexual development encounters abuse, shame, rejection, or other wounding experiences that create unconscious associations between sexuality and psychological themes like power reversal, control recovery, emotional healing, or revenge that then get played out repeatedly through compulsive fantasy patterns. The programming mechanism explains why sexual fantasy content often feels foreign or disturbing to the conscious personality while simultaneously feeling compulsive and irresistible. The fantasy represents unconscious programming rather than authentic desire, but the programming has become so embedded that it feels like natural sexual preference. Jung's analysis also reveals how media exposure creates unconscious sexual programming through repeated exposure to pornographic imagery, romantic narratives, and sexual representations that become internalized as templates for sexual fantasy and expectation despite having little connection to authentic sexuality or real relationship dynamics. Religious and moral programming often creates what Jung called forbidden fruit, dynamics where sexual content becomes compulsive precisely because it was labeled as forbidden or shameful during moral development. The unconscious rebellion against repressive conditioning generates fantasy content that contradicts conscious moral values. Family programming involves unconscious absorption of parental attitudes toward sexuality, relationship dynamics, gender roles, and emotional expression that become embedded in sexual fantasy as attempts to resolve unconscious conflicts about intimacy, power, worthiness, and authentic self-expression that were never consciously addressed. The programming analysis explains why people often feel confused or ashamed about their fantasy content, experiencing it as alien to their authentic self while being unable to control or eliminate it through conscious effort. The fantasy represents unconscious programming rather than conscious choice. Jung's therapeutic approach involved helping patients identify the sources of their sexual programming through analysis of early experiences, cultural influences, and family dynamics that shaped their unconscious sexual associations, allowing conscious integration of this material rather than continued unconscious expression through compul.